The flash of red and blue lights painted Ricardo Costello's face in strobing shades of defeat. He was on his knees, the expensive fabric of his suit soiled by the grimy asphalt of the loading dock. Around him, the shouts of federal agents echoed, a symphony of his demise. His empire, built on fear and cemented with blood, was crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. He looked up, his eyes wild with disbelief, and saw her. Not the CEO, not the rival, but the waitress, the insignificant girl from the restaurant, standing calmly beside the lead agent, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. And in that moment, Ricardo the Bull Costello knew he hadn't been toppled by a king. He had been annihilated by a ghost. 2 weeks earlier, the ghost was named Ava, and she was clearing table 7. Ricardo Costello's voice was a gravelly boom that consumed all other sound in the elegant dining room of the Gilded Spoon. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and slammed his empty wineglass on the table. "More wine, sweetheart, and bring some real bread this time, not this bird food." Ava, her face a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality, approached the table. "Right away, sir." His eyes, small and dark like a boar's, raked over her simple black uniform. He sneered, a deliberate act of performance for the sycophants flanking him. "Look at this, boys. This is what happens when you don't listen to your father. You end up refilling my glass for pocket change." His men chuckled on cue. Ava ignored them, her movements economical and precise as she collected the dirty plates. Her focus was a shield. One of Ricardo's lieutenants, a man named Leo, with slicked-back hair and a cruel mouth, deliberately knocked his fork to the floor. "Oops," he said, not even looking at her. "Pick that up." Ava bent down, her jaw tight. As she retrieved the fork, she saw Ricardo watching her. He wasn't just enjoying the show, he was studying her, gauging her breaking point. It was a test, and she knew she had to fail it in the way he expected. She had to be weak. Later, as she brought the bill for another table, a young couple celebrating an anniversary, the woman pressed a folded $5 bill into her hand. "This is for you," she whispered with a kind smile. "You've been so patient with them." Ava's throat felt tight. "Thank you." Before she could pocket the small mercy, Ricardo's voice cut through the air again. "Hey, you. Waitress." He beckoned her over with a flick of his thick fingers. She approached his table, the crumpled bill still in her palm. "What is that?" he grunted, gesturing to her hand. "A tip, sir." Ricardo chuckled, a low, menacing rumble. "A tip? How cute." He snatched the bill from her hand. Ava flinched but held her ground. He smoothed it out, examined it with mock seriousness, then pulled a thick cigar from his breast pocket. With a flick of a gold lighter, he lit the corner of the $5 bill. The paper curled, turning black at the edges as the flame greedily consumed the portrait of Lincoln. He used the burning money to light the end of his cigar, taking a long, theatrical puff. The room fell silent. The young couple stared in horror. Ricardo let the charred remains of the bill fall from his fingers. The hot ash landed on the back of Ava's hand, a searing, grey kiss of contempt. She didn't cry out. She didn't even move. She just stood there as the smell of burnt paper and cheap tobacco filled the air. "There," Ricardo said, blowing a plume of smoke in her face. "Now it's worth something." He laughed, and his men joined in, their cackles echoing in the stunned silence. He saw only a humiliated waitress, a powerless girl he could crush for sport. He didn't see the ice in her eyes, or the way her mind was cataloguing every detail, the tremor in Leo's hand, the nervous tick of the man to his left, the specific brand of untraceable cell phone he'd placed on the table. He saw a victim. He had no idea he was looking at the architect of his ruin. The waitress persona was a shell, a ghost identity for Isabella Rossi, the sole heir and clandestine owner of the Rossi Hospitality Group, which included this very restaurant. Her apartment wasn't the cramped, run-down studio her colleagues assumed she lived in. It was a sterile, high-tech command center overlooking the city's glittering skyline. The walls were a mosaic of monitors, displaying encrypted communications, architectural blueprints, and live surveillance feeds from every one of her properties. That night, Isabella, stripped of Ava's cheap uniform and clad in simple grey sweats, stood before the main screen. The face of Riccardo Costello stared back at her. She replayed the security footage from the restaurant, her software isolating and enhancing the audio. "Bring some real bread this time, not this bird food." She muted the sound. "Engage micro-expression analysis," she commanded the empty room. The program overlaid a wireframe grid on Riccardo's face, tracking the millisecond-long twitches of muscles around his eyes and mouth. Contempt. Dominance. But something else flickered beneath the surface. A flicker of anxiety when he glanced at the restaurant's manager, a man named Peterson. Isabella zoomed in on Riccardo's hands. As he belittled her, his left hand, resting on his thigh below the table, made a gesture, a closed fist, with the thumb brushing twice against the index finger. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. Cross-reference gesture with Global Criminal Sign Language Database. Focus on financial and logistical signals. Seconds later, a result flashed on the screen. Signal: the container is clean. Proceed with the exchange. Common usage: narcotics and weapons trafficking. Isabella's face was grim. Her father had built this empire on good food and integrity. Now, men like Costello were using it as a sewer. Her undercover operation, initially designed to root out internal theft, had stumbled upon something far more venomous. She brought up the employee file for Peterson, the manager. Financial records showed a sudden influx of cash into his accounts and disguised as gambling winnings. She cross-referenced the dates of the deposits. They perfectly matched the shipping dates of produce from a new supplier Riccardo's associates had forced on the restaurant 6 months ago. The bread he'd complained about wasn't just bad. It was a message. It came from a bakery that was a known front for the Costello family. He wasn't just being a bully. He was communicating with his inside man right in front of her. "You lit a $5 bill to show me I was worthless," Isabella whispered to the screen. "But you just handed me the keys to your entire kingdom." She felt the phantom burn on the back of her hand and made a silent vow. She wasn't just going to expose him. She was going to burn his world to the ground and scatter the ashes. The point of no return came 3 days later. Isabella had been documenting the movement of the supply trucks, building a precise timeline of the illicit shipments being funneled through her restaurant's storerooms. She was getting close, and someone was getting nervous. She finished her shift as Ava, the tired waitress, the weight of a double shift pressing on her shoulders. The exhaustion was real, a useful piece of her camouflage. She walked down the quiet side street toward the subway, the city lights blurring around her. A black van, the kind with no windows, screeched to a halt beside her. 2 large men jumped out. She didn't have time to scream. A hand clamped over her mouth, and a thick canvas bag was pulled over her head. She was thrown into the back of the van, the metal floor cold against her cheek. They weren't professionals. They were clumsy, breathing heavily, smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. They were thugs, not assassins. This wasn't an execution. It was an abduction. Riccardo was sending a message. Hours later, they dragged her into what smelled like a disused warehouse, damp concrete and rust. They threw her onto a dusty floor and left, the heavy metal door booming shut. She lay there, taking inventory. No serious injuries. Her hands were bound with a zip tie, but they'd been careless. They hadn't checked her shoes. She worked her foot free from her worn-out sneaker. Taped inside the sole was a small, flat piece of high-tensile carbon fiber, no bigger than a paperclip. It was a lockpick set, a precaution she'd built into every part of her Ava identity. But before she could work on the zip tie, she heard them returning. Not the thugs. This time it was Ricardo. He entered the room, a silhouette against the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "So," he began, circling her like a shark. "The little mouse. You've been squeaking too much, seeing things you shouldn't see." He didn't know who she was. This was a crude, brutish warning shot aimed at a nosy waitress. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling just enough. He laughed. "Don't you? My manager, Peterson, he says you're always watching, always listening. We don't like that." He crouched down, his face inches from hers. His breath was foul, a mix of garlic and stale wine. "So my boys paid a visit to your little apartment, just to make sure you didn't write anything down." Isabella's blood ran cold. "Found this," he said, dangling a silver chain in front of her face. It was her father's St. Christopher medal, the one he wore every day of his life. She always kept it on her bedside table. And this. He tossed a shattered picture frame onto the floor beside her. The glass was gone, but she could see the torn photograph within. It was the last picture she had of her and her father, taken a month before he died. They were smiling, standing in the kitchen of the very first restaurant he ever opened. A large, muddy boot print was stamped across his smiling face. Something inside Isabella snapped. The cold, calculating strategist was consumed by a wave of pure, white-hot rage. This was no longer about business. This wasn't about justice. This was about family. He had desecrated a memory. He had put his filth on the one thing in her life that was sacred. "You're a dead man," she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. Ricardo laughed, louder this time. "Oh, the little mouse has teeth. That's cute." He stood up, dusting off his hands. "You're going to disappear, sweetheart. No one will even remember your name." He left, but he had made a fatal error. He thought he had broken her spirit. Instead, he had just unshackled the monster. Isabella lay in the darkness, the image of her father's defiled face burned into her mind. The grief and rage coalesced into a diamond-hard point of focus. She was no longer just Ava or Isabella. She was an instrument of vengeance. The thugs, Leo and another brute, were lazy. They sat outside the door, playing cards on a crate, their conversation drifting through the thin metal. They complained about the coffee Ricardo provided, a cheap, bitter brand. But Leo bragged about his personal stash, a premium espresso blend called Silvano's Choice. Isabella's mind raced. Silvano's, one of her smaller, independent suppliers. A good man, but his business was struggling. He would be susceptible to an offer. She filed the name away. Ricardo had made another mistake. He assumed she was alone and insignificant. He didn't know about the dead man's switch, a simple, elegant protocol she'd established when she first went undercover. Every 12 hours, she had to log into a secure server using a multi-factor authentication process. If an interval was missed, the system would automatically execute a pre-programmed command. Her 12-hour window had closed an hour ago. Somewhere across the city, in a server farm buried deep underground, a single line of code was triggered. An anonymous, heavily encrypted email was sent from a spoofed address to a specific agent at the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. The email contained no text, just an attachment, a single 9-digit number. The employer identification number for a shell corporation called Atlantic Holdings Group. Isabella heard a phone buzz outside the door. Leo answered it. His voice changed from bored to panicked. What? What do you mean, frozen? All of it? A pause. The feds? How? She heard him talking to Ricardo, his voice a frantic whisper. Ricardo started shouting, a string of curses that echoed in the warehouse. He was losing his mind. He was being hit where it hurt most, his money. He was so consumed by the sudden, inexplicable financial attack that he wouldn't connect it to the worthless waitress tied up in his warehouse. He'd see it as a betrayal, a rival move, anything but her. The chaos was her cover. While Ricardo screamed into his phone about millions of dollars vanishing into federal limbo, Isabella got to work. She twisted her body, retrieving the carbon fiber pick from her shoe. Her fingers, nimble and sure, worked at the zip tie's locking mechanism. It was a cheap, standard-issue tie. It took her less than a minute. The plastic parted with a soft click. She was free. She waited. The guards were agitated, distracted by Ricardo's fury. She heard him storm out, his car peeling away into the night. Leo and his partner were left to deal with her. Boss says to take her out to the marshes. Make it look like a mugging. Isabella pressed her ear to the cold metal door. She could hear them arguing about whose car to use. This was her chance. At the far end of the room was a small, grimy window, about 20 feet up the concrete wall. Below it, shelves of old, rusted machine parts were stacked precariously. It was a risk, but it was the only way. She moved silently, a shadow in the dim light. She began to climb the shelving unit, her muscles screaming in protest. The metal groaned under her weight. She froze, listening. The guards were still arguing. She kept climbing. Her fingers closed around the window ledge. It was slick with grime. She pulled herself up, her body trembling with exertion. The latch was rusted shut. She used the pick from her shoe, jamming it into the mechanism and forcing it. It gave way with a sharp crack. She squeezed through the narrow opening, cutting her arm on a shard of broken glass. She didn't feel the pain. Below her was a 3-story drop into a dark, narrow alley. Without hesitating, she jumped, aiming for the overflowing dumpster she'd spotted from the window. She landed hard in a pile of garbage bags, the impact knocking the wind out of her. For a moment, she lay there, gasping for air, the stench of rotting food filling her lungs. Then she heard shouting from the warehouse. They knew she was gone. She scrambled out of the dumpster and ran. She didn't look back. She melted into the city's shadows, a ghost with a vendetta. She didn't go to the police. The system was too slow, too corrupt. Ricardo had people on the inside. No, this had to be her kill. Her first stop was a 24-hour pharmacy to clean the gash on her arm. Her next was a burner phone. Her third call was to a man named Gabriel, the head of her family's private security. He was ex-Mossad, fiercely loyal, and the only person who knew about her undercover operation. Isabella, your check-in was missed. We were about to activate the extraction protocol. His voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension. Change of plans, Gabriel. We're moving from reconnaissance to scorched earth. I need the team. Understood. Where and when? Rendezvous at the downtown safe house. And Gabriel, bring the big toys. The safe house was a nondescript brownstone that her father had purchased decades ago. Inside, it was a fortress, equipped with a state-of-the-art forensics lab and an armory that would make a small country jealous. Her team assembled. Gabriel, a hacker named Anya, who could break into anything digital, and 2 former Special Forces operators for muscle. Isabella stood before them, no longer Ava the waitress, but a commander preparing for war. Her eyes were hard, her voice devoid of emotion. Ricardo Costello used my restaurant as a hub for his criminal enterprise. He kidnapped me, and he destroyed this. She projected the image of the boot-stamped photograph of her and her father onto a large screen. A collective intake of breath filled the room. He tried to erase my father's memory. We are going to erase his entire existence. The investigation began at a blistering pace. Anya worked on the manager, Peterson. "I'm in his laptop," she announced a few hours later. "He's sloppy. His password was his dog's name." She cloned his entire hard drive, every email, every document, every illicit transaction. Meanwhile, Isabella focused on the supply chain. She pulled the records for Silvano's Choice Espresso, the brand the thug Leo favored. She found the address for Silvano's small warehouse. She and Gabriel went there, not as law enforcement, but as potential business partners. Mr. Silvano was an old man with kind eyes and defeated shoulders. Isabella, now dressed in a sharp business suit, spoke to him in fluent Italian. She didn't threaten him. She offered him a lifeline. "Mr. Silvano, I know the Costello family has been pressuring you, forcing you to move their products, along with your coffee beans. I know they pay you pennies and threaten your family if you refuse." The old man's face turned ashen. "I am Isabella Rossi," she continued softly. "I own the Gilded Spoon. I am offering you a choice. You help me, and I will give you an exclusive, multi-year contract to supply every restaurant in my portfolio. Your family will be set for life. You refuse me, and I walk away. But I assure you, Mr. Costello will not." She left him with a burner phone and a choice. He called 2 hours later. He told her everything. The next shipment was arriving tomorrow night, hidden inside hollowed-out crates of coffee beans. That night, Isabella and her team watched from a rooftop as the truck arrived at Silvano's warehouse. As the crates were being unloaded, one of her operators, moving like a phantom, slipped from the shadows and attached a magnetic GPS tracker to the truck's undercarriage. Anya tracked its movement. It didn't go to the restaurant. It went to a refrigerated storage facility near the docks, a facility owned by another Costello shell company. The final piece came from Peterson's cloned hard drive. Buried in a hidden partition, Anya found a password-protected file. It took her 4 hours to crack it. Inside wasn't a digital ledger. It was a series of high-resolution photographs of a physical book. A handwritten ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and figures. It detailed every bribe, every dirty deal, and on the final page, a single, massive payment to a name that made Isabella's blood run cold. Deputy Mayor Robert Henderson, the man in charge of the city's business licensing and zoning, the man who had presented her father with a Man of the Year award 5 years ago. "That's the final blow," Isabella said, her voice a low growl. "But a digital copy isn't enough. We need the book." The ledger, according to a panicked email from Peterson to his wife, was kept in a floor safe in his office at the restaurant. A safe Isabella herself had authorized the installation of. She knew its specifications, its weaknesses. That night, the Gilded Spoon was silent and dark. Isabella, dressed in black, moved through the familiar dining room, a ghost in her own home. She bypassed the alarm system she had designed. In Peterson's office, she knelt before the safe, hidden beneath a plush rug. Using a miniature drill and a fiber-optic scope, she bypassed the lock in under 10 minutes. Inside, nestled amongst stacks of cash, was the ledger. It felt heavy in her hands, a testament to years of corruption. She took it, leaving the money untouched. This was never about the money. She had the weapon. Now, she just needed the stage, and she knew exactly where it would be. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns. It was the annual Restaurant Association Gala, the biggest night of the year for the city's culinary elite. And tonight, the guest of honor, receiving the coveted Community Keystone Award, was Riccardo Costello. He'd bought the award, of course, a pathetic attempt to launder his reputation. He stood at the center of the room, a planet of ego with orbiting sycophants. A glass of ludicrously expensive champagne was in his hand, his laughter a cannonade that demanded attention. He was at the absolute peak of his hubris. The IRS problem had been a temporary annoyance, a mosquito bite easily soothed by his army of crooked accountants. The waitress, Ava, had simply vanished, a footnote he'd already forgotten. He was untouchable, a king in his castle, surrounded by people who feared him, which he mistook for respect. He leaned over to Deputy Mayor Henderson, who sat at the head table looking pale and nervous. "Relax, Bobby," Riccardo grunted, clapping a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. "That little IRS scare was nothing, a rival getting cute. I handled it." He took a long sip of champagne. "Just like I handled that nosy waitress from the Rossi place. Some people just need to learn their place." He chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "She won't be a problem for anyone, ever again." Riccardo surveyed the room, a surge of pure, unadulterated power coursing through him. He owned this city. He owned everyone in this room. He was a god. Then the ballroom doors swung open. A hush fell over the room, a wave of silence that washed over the chatter and music, so sudden it was almost violent. He turned, annoyed at the interruption, and he saw her. It wasn't a waitress. It was a goddess of vengeance, clad in a simple, elegant black dress that seemed to absorb the light around it. Her hair was pulled back severely, accentuating the sharp lines of her face and the cold fury in her eyes. A murmur went through the crowd as people recognized the ghost, the myth. Isabella Rossi. The sole heir to the Rossi empire, a woman no one had seen in public since her father's funeral. Riccardo's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. His face went slack, a mask of confusion. There was something familiar in her eyes, a flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place. He saw power, he saw wealth, but his brutish mind refused to make the connection. It was impossible. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by too much champagne. The evening's host, a flustered local news anchor, hurried to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor. It seems we have a very special surprise guest. To present our Community Keystone Award, please welcome the visionary leader of the Rossi Hospitality Group, Ms. Isabella Rossi." A wave of polite, intrigued applause filled the room. Isabella walked toward the stage, her heels clicking on the polished marble with the precise, deliberate rhythm of a ticking clock. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at Riccardo. As she passed his table, their eyes met. And in that instant, the impossible became terrifyingly real for him. The hair, the eyes, the defiant set of her jaw. It was her, the waitress. His boorish smile dissolved, replaced by a pallor of dawning horror. His hand began to shake, and a single drop of champagne spilled onto his polished shoe. Isabella stepped up to the podium, the grand screens behind her displaying the gala's logo. She adjusted the microphone, the small sound echoing in the now silent ballroom. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm and clear, each word a perfectly sharpened blade. "My apologies for the intrusion. There's been a change to the program." She looked directly at Riccardo, a predator singling out its prey. "We are still going to honor a man tonight, a man whose contributions to our community have been substantial, but his name is not Riccardo Costello." Riccardo stumbled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What is this? Security! Get this woman off the stage. She's crashing my event." Isabella didn't even glance at the two security guards who started to approach, only to be halted by a subtle shake of the head from Gabriel, who stood impassively near the wall. "Your event, Ricardo?" Isabella asked, a hint of steel in her voice. "This hotel is a Rossi property. This gala is sponsored by the Rossi Group. You are a guest in my house, and you have been a very, very bad guest." Her eyes flicked to the screens behind her. The gala logo dissolved. It was replaced by a high-resolution, full-screen image of a handwritten ledger page. Names, dates, illegal transactions. Gasps rippled through the audience like a physical shockwave. Deputy Mayor Henderson, sitting at the head table, choked on his water, his face turning the color of ash. "For months," Isabella continued, her voice gaining a hard, metallic edge, "Mr. Costello has been using our city's finest businesses, including my own, as a pipeline for his criminal enterprise. He has trafficked illicit goods, he has laundered money, and he has bribed public officials to look the other way." The screen changed again, now showing the precise GPS route of the truck, a glowing red line snaking from Silvano's warehouse to the storage facility near the docks. It was followed by crystal-clear infrared drone footage showing crates being unloaded into the hands of known Costello enforcers. Ricardo's face was a grotesque mask of purple rage. "Lies! This is slander! Doctored photos! Who the hell do you think you are? You're a nobody!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. Isabella didn't flinch. A small, cold smile touched her lips. "A nobody? That's what you thought, wasn't it? You know, I've been called a lot of things. A ghost, a myth. But my favorite was sweetheart. You called me that, remember? Right before you told me to bring you some real bread, not this bird food." A flicker of pure confusion warred with the rage on Ricardo's face. "You thought you were just being a bully," Isabella explained, her voice dropping, as if sharing a secret with the entire room. "But you were sending a signal to your man Peterson. The bird food bread came from your front bakery. You were telling him the shipment was compromised. It was a clever little code. But I speak your language, Ricardo. I speak it better than you do." The screen behind her changed again. It was security footage from the Gilded Spoon. It showed Ricardo, sneering as he snatched the $5 bill from Ava's hand. The entire room watched in horrified silence as he pulled out his gold lighter and set the bill on fire. "You thought you were making a point," Isabella said softly. "But you made a mistake. You see, I always keep 2 lighters on my service tray. One is a cheap backup. The other is an exact replica of a very expensive brand, the kind a man like you would carry. You were so focused on the money, so intent on your little performance, you never noticed the switch." The footage zoomed in, a microsecond of sleight of hand as she took the dirty plates, her fingers brushing his jacket pocket. "The lighter you used to burn that bill, the one you've been carrying for 2 weeks, wasn't yours," she revealed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried through the entire room. "It was mine, a custom-built device from my company's R&D division. It's a high-fidelity audio recorder with its own cellular connection. I've heard every secret you've ever whispered, Ricardo. I heard you order the hit on the union boss. I heard you plan to frame your own cousin for tax evasion. And I heard you, just tonight, laughing with Mayor Henderson about the worthless waitress you made disappear." The blood drained from Ricardo's face. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out the gold lighter, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. He looked from the lighter to his phone. "Oh, and the phone," Isabella added, as if it were an afterthought. "The Acheron model. Untraceable, you thought? It is. To everyone but the person who holds the master encryption key, Me. Between the lighter in your pocket and the phone in your hand, you've been my own personal broadcast network for 14 days. He was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, for an ally. He found none. Every face was turned away from him, a sea of condemnation. He was utterly alone. You came into my restaurant. Isabella's voice was now low, personal, filled with a righteous fury that made the air crackle. You sat at my table, you disrespected my staff, and you burned my money in front of my face to show me how little I was worth. She held up her right hand, showing the faint, silvery scar on the back. You left your mark on me, Ricardo. Now, I'm leaving my mark on you. She paused, letting the weight of her words crush him. You were right about one thing, though. I am a waitress. I bring people what they deserve. And tonight, Ricardo, your check has come due. As if summoned by her words, an elderly, dignified man stepped out from the wings of the stage. He was holding a worn, leather-bound book. It was Mr. Silvano. His eyes, no longer defeated, shone with a quiet, terrified courage. He placed the ledger on the podium in front of Isabella. "This is not a copy," Isabella announced, placing her hand on the book. "This is the original, a gift from a brave man you tried to ruin." On cue, the grand ballroom doors burst open. They didn't just open, they were kicked in. Federal agents in tactical gear swarmed into the room, weapons raised, red laser dots dancing across the panicked crowd. "FBI, nobody move!" an agent bellowed. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled for cover under tables. Ricardo, his mind finally snapping, turned to run. But Gabriel and his two operators were there, materializing from the crowd like specters, forming a human wall. There was nowhere to go. The lead agent, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and an expression of grim satisfaction, walked calmly through the chaos, directly towards Ricardo. He stopped, his eyes widening in a new kind of shock. It was the woman from the restaurant, the one who had given the waitress the tip. "Agent Miller, FBI," she said, flashing her badge. "You know, Ricardo, 20 years ago, you strong-armed a small Italian bakery into bankruptcy. My father's bakery. You took everything from us. I chose my career that day." She smiled, a razor-thin, cold expression. "When an anonymous email with your holding company's EIN landed in my inbox, I knew my day had finally come. Then, when I saw the name Isabella Rossi attached to the full file, well, let's just say I was happy to help set the table for tonight's main course." She leaned in close. "Remember me, Ricardo?" she whispered. "You burned my tip. This is the receipt." She personally slammed him against the head table, the one where he had been celebrated moments before. Champagne flutes, plates of half-eaten dessert, and his ridiculous award went flying, the sound of shattering glass a final, percussive note in his ruined symphony. They twisted his arms behind his back and cuffed him, the click of the metal echoing his fate. As they dragged him away, his expensive suit disheveled and stained with wine and frosting, he looked back at the stage. Isabella hadn't moved. She just watched him, her expression as placid as a frozen lake. In her eyes, he finally saw the ghost of the waitress, the memory of her silent endurance. And he finally, truly understood. He hadn't been toppled by a rival. He had been meticulously dismantled by an insignificant girl he had tried to crush for sport. The aftermath was a cleansing fire. The ledger, authenticated by Mr. Silvano's testimony and corroborated by hundreds of hours of recordings from the lighter, brought down not just Costello's entire organization, but a dozen corrupt city officials, including Deputy Mayor Henderson, who was arrested trying to board a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty. The story was on every news channel, a modern-day legend, the phantom CEO who emerged from the shadows to serve a cold dish of justice. A week later, the Gilded Spoon was quiet before the evening rush. In the staff kitchen, the cooks, servers, and dishwashers were gathered around a small television set mounted on the wall. The screen showed Ricardo Costello, hollow-eyed and clad in an orange jumpsuit, being led into a federal courthouse, his face a mask of impotent fury. The headline read, "No bail for former kingpin." There was no cheering in the kitchen, just a shared, silent nod of profound relief. A quiet dignity had been restored to their workplace, to their lives. Isabella, dressed in a clean, crisp waitress uniform, poured a cup of coffee for the elderly head chef, who patted her hand. She wasn't the CEO today. She was just Ava, one of them, sharing in the quiet victory. Maria, the young hostess Ricardo had once made cry over a misplaced reservation, walked over to her. Her eyes were bright. "He took our dignity," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave it back." She didn't say another word. She just pushed the communal tip jar, a large glass mason jar, towards Isabella. It was a gesture of solidarity, of gratitude, of family. Isabella smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a crisp, new $100 bill. She folded it neatly and slid it into the jar amongst the crumpled ones and fives. "For all of us," she said softly. "The house always wins." The burn mark on the back of her hand had faded to a pale, silvery scar. It no longer hurt. It was a brand, a reminder that her father's legacy wasn't just in the name over the door, but in the people who worked within its walls. Sometimes, the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who clears the table, who listens, who watches, and who waits for the perfect moment to serve justice, cold and absolute. Like, share, and comment your thoughts on this ending.